Hello, everybody. Welcome to our new time for these live streams. There's a lot to talk about. And I guess the first thought is we need the Green Party more than ever. You know, I've talked about the problems, with Biden's domestic policy, his non-plan on climate, in the infrastructure package, the miserly benefits in the American Families Plan. We talked a little bit about the failures at the border, but what's on my mind this week is how U.S. imperialism hasn't skipped a beat from Trump to Biden. Now, today, particularly since it's the 73rd anniversary of the Nakba, the catastrophe, is what the Palestinians call it, when they lost, access to their land within what became Israel. And now we have this conflict going on. Biden says Israel has a right to defend itself, but it's the occupying power. It's not that they're fighting a foreign power. They've taken responsibility. So this all got started, not as you might think in the media when Hamas started firing rockets into Israel, but with the ethnic cleansing in East Jerusalem, neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, and the attacks on worshipers toward the end of Ramadan at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this is with a piece of all the bullying, intimidation, and violence by Israeli settlers on the West Bank against Palestinians and their property. And Biden is completely implicated in this. He affirmed Trump's move of the capital, or where our embassy is, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And now the Israelis are trying to clean out a Palestinian neighborhood to move in settlers in East Jerusalem. Yet Biden administration is giving unconditional support to Israel. And now you've got these right-wing Israeli gangs with an ethno-nationalist ideology attacking Israeli Arabs in their homes, in their neighborhoods. And so there's conflict in mixed Israeli cities that we haven't seen before between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. So it's a really bad situation. Now, instead of unconditional support, we've always said BDS, boycott, divest, sanctions, until Israel starts respecting the human rights of Palestinians and international law. And the prospects don't look good for the administration doing that. The National BDS Committee, National Palestinian BDS Committee, has urged that the first sanctions be military. We give $4 billion a year in military aid to Israel. And you see the consequences of that right before our eyes now. And politically, Netanyahu, he's facing bribery and corruption charges. He was not able to form a government after the last election. So he has every incentive to divert attention from his political problems and try to lay the basis for a fifth election in 2 years where he will try to retain power. Israeli politics has moved so far to the right, and they've done that with complete unconditional U.S. support. That's why I think the best thing that the United States could do is begin to start cut military aid and start applying progressively boycott, divestment, and sanctions measures until Israel starts respecting the human rights of Palestinians. And then, Hamas has its own political problems. So it's building its political base by saying we're standing up to Israel. So it's hard to see how this thing's going to unwind anytime soon. And the U.S., which wants to play a neutral broker, it says, but because of its unconditional support with Israel, is not trusted by the Palestinian side. And this really goes back also to those diplomatic agreements that the Trump administration made with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Morocco that, normalized relationships and said nothing about the Palestinians. So the Palestinians are very frustrated. This is a bad situation, but I think nonviolent action like we did against apartheid South Africa with sanctions is what we've got to do with apartheid Israel. And this is something we got to speak up about and make it politically costly for the administration to continue on its current path. The one optimistic thing is that U.S. public opinion, including within the Jewish community, has really changed as Israel's moved further and further to the right. And more people are not willing to abide that. So that's something we can build upon. Another situation is where the U.S. has a lot of responsibility is the violent political repression going on against people demonstrating in Colombia, first of all, against neoliberal austerity measures. And now that the police are cracking down against police brutality and, many deaths in the demonstrations. The U.S. has 7 military bases in Colombia. We have pretty much trained their whole military, and their police are part of their military. One of the demands of the demonstrations is to disband these riot police, who are acting like during a counterinsurgency war with the FARC, even though a peace agreement was agreed to several years ago. So this is another place where Biden, who had a lot to do with Plan Colombia, which really militarized the conflict back during the Clinton administration, has a lot of responsibility. And he has no inclination to change course unless we put the pressure on him and on representatives of Congress that can add to the pressure. So I think that's another area where we got to speak up. And then, political repression doesn't just happen beyond our borders. Here in New York State, the Democrats passed a law under the cover of the coronavirus pandemic that tripled the number of votes we need to keep our ballot line, double the frequency. We have to get it from every 4 years to every 2 years. And then if we lost our ballot line, like we did in 2020, tripled the signatures we got to get back on the ballot line to try to qualify with enough votes. So now, instead of 15,000 signatures in 6 weeks, it's 45,000 signatures in 6 weeks, which makes it about the toughest petition to get on the ballot of any state in the country. So I think that all comes back to we've got to fight for our own democratic rights as well. Fair ballot access. There should be a federal law. John Conyers used to introduce a bill for that back in the late 80s through the late 90s that would have lowered the requirements and had a federal standard for federal elections. Where are these progressive Democrats on that question today in Congress? There's no such legislation. If you're in one of those districts where you have a so-called Democratic Socialist or Progressive Democrat, a member of the squad, you should approach them about, making access to the ballot, which is fundamental. Running for office is the fullest expression of the First Amendment. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, petition the government for redress of grievances. And in this country, we're off the charts. You want to run as an independent for the House of Commons in the UK, it's 10 signatures. In most states in the United States, you want to run as an independent for Congress, it's thousands or tens of thousands of signatures. You want to do it in New Zealand, it's 2 signatures. In India, 2 signatures. In Australia, 50 signatures. In Canada, next door, 100 signatures. Or if you're in a rural riding, that's what they call their congressional districts for their parliament, it's 50 signatures. Here it's thousands or tens of thousands. I mean, we have a lot of nerve talking about, trying to be the beacon of democracy against authoritarian regimes, which is a real problem. But we don't practice it ourselves. Aside from the access to the ballot, why does this country have the largest prison system in the history of the world, with a quarter of the world's prisoners locked up in this country? And then I think, as I've been talking about a lot, we've really got to push, and this is something we can win in the near future in local areas, in states, and eventually, hopefully soon at the federal level. And that is ranked choice voting, including especially ranked choice voting for multi-member districts for legislative bodies, because that gives you proportional representation. And if the Greens are a 10 or 20% party in a multi-member district, we should get 10 or 20% of the seats in the legislative body. And that gives us a foothold in the political system. The way it is now, under single member district plurality voting, we're always seen as a spoiler. Progressives, particularly with the Republican Party, not just a conservative party these days, but an extremist, racist, authoritarian, irrationalist, anti-scientific, conspiracy-mongering nut job. That's what the Republican Party has become. So progressives more than ever feel compelled to vote for corporate Democrats to stop Republican extremists, which makes it harder than ever for the independent left, like the Green Party, to even get a hearing in elections. So I think that's a crucial thing we got to work on. So, yeah, there are a lot of problems, but I think the fact that we can win ranked choice voting and have been in a lot of states, well, 2 states, and now it's so over 50 cities, 23 cities and towns in Utah are going to have ranked choice voting elections this year. So we're making progress on that front, and we got to build on that. So I'll stop there and be happy to take questions. So somebody asked, what do you say to those who talk about both sides in the Palestinian-Israel hostilities? Isn't Hamas also firing weapons? Yeah, there are 2 sides, obviously, but which side is the colonizer, the oppressor, and which side is resisting that? I think you have to make that distinction. And I think firing rockets into civilian areas without warning by Hamas, that's a war crime. But it doesn't mean Israel isn't also committing war crimes, and they have much more capacity to inflict violence. The International Criminal Court is looking at the last war, 2014, and examining war crimes by Israel. So they're both sides. Yeah, they're 2 sides, but it doesn't mean they're equivalent. And while we condemn particular actions by people on both sides, we have to understand that it's one thing to resist occupation and colonization, and it's another thing to impose it. Scout Trooper 164, what does the mainstream media avoid telling people that Palestine is using handmade rockets while Israel is using weapons given to them to colonize their land? Yeah, the most of the reporting doesn't really talk about how more destructive and potent the Israeli weapons are compared to what Hamas has put together in Gaza. And you got to remember, Gaza is a little strip. I think it's not much bigger than Manhattan, with 2 million people in it. It's been blockaded. There's sitting ducks over there. And Israel has this Iron Dome. I think that's what they call it, their anti-missile defense, which gets most of those rockets that are launched by Hamas. So I think the disparity in each of their military's potency is something the mainstream media is missing. And the more important thing is they're missing the fact that the Palestinians are occupied, colonized, and the Israelis are doing it. And the immorality and injustice of that is what the mainstream media misses more than anything else. Rob D. Rich, who are Palestinians' allies, and why isn't there anyone else stepping in? Yeah, the Palestinians are without allies. The other Arab countries have made their peace with Israel. They're really on their own. There are movements on the left and human rights community that are speaking up for the Palestinians, but not any states. And the UN, passes resolutions, but doesn't have the capacity to enforce them. Israel totally defies those resolutions, and which, amount to international law. The international law says there should be a 2-state solution negotiated. The problem is the Israelis have occupied so much of what would have been the Palestinian state that now that is not a viable solution. and more people, particularly on the Palestinian side, are saying we've got to fight for one secular democratic state where everybody's rights are respected and everybody has equal rights. That isn't easy either, given the ethno-nationalism on the Israeli side. It has got stronger and stronger. And, there's an element of that in the Palestinian side because they've been victimized by the Israeli state for so long. So doing that reconciliation is going to be a tough job. But I think it can be done. It was done to a great degree in South Africa. Not that the indigenous Africans have economic justice, but they certainly have political rights, and it's not what people feared, a race war. So I don't think it's hopeless, but the allies are people like us, just people. There are no states that are really sticking up for the Palestinians, and the UN is impotent. Scout Trooper 164. Why has since World War II that the United States has been allying with dictators, including the Israel colonizers? That's because the U.S. is an empire. There was planning, what was it called? The area groups or something. I mean, even before we got into World War II, the Council on Foreign Relations, the elites in this country, the Wall Street bankers and the big businesses and their think tanks, they were figuring how they could basically replace the European colonial countries as World War II was getting underway with the U.S., not having formal colonies, but economic and political hegemony. And their first planning was they assumed Hitler would get his own sphere of influence, and then we would get the rest of the world. And as the war unfolded, they realized Hitler was going to lose, and it was going to be Stalin that had a sphere of influence. So they adjusted their planning. The U.S., the whole history of the U.S. is empire building, going back to expanding the colonies at the expense of indigenous nations, and then Mexico, and then out into the Pacific with Hawaii, and 1898, taking possessions from Spain, the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and so forth. So this is a long story. So why? It was really a continuation of the capitalists in this country wanting an empire where they could exploit people and extract resources and get even richer. So the only thing different after World War II is that our military-industrial complex is massive. It's a permanent war apparatus. And that's partly why we're in all these wars, because if you look at capitalism, particularly since about 1970, it's been a chronic crisis of overproduction. When capitalists have money, there are not that many profitable investment opportunities in the real economy of production. So they financialize the economy and make their money off economic rents, basically unearned income. Debt, holding monopoly positions like intellectual property or real estate, and extracting more from us without expanding the real economy that much. And part of that is basically getting wealth by appropriation through this military empire that defends these corporations marauding the earth. So it's a system of capitalist imperialism that is now backed by, and our military contractors make a lot of money off wars. So they encourage them, and they're part of the power structure. So they used to call it a permanent war economy because it kept the real economy of production going. Now it's a permanent war economy because it keeps the arms contractors and all those sectors of the military that have been privatized. I mean, under neoliberalism, it's not just schools with charter schools or perpetuating private health insurance. They started outsourcing a lot of things the military used to do in-house at less cost. Concessions, providing food, but also providing military operations with private contractors, basically mercenary firms like Eric Prince's outfits, Blackwater and its successors. And one of the things, we're getting our formal troops out of Afghanistan, but there's a lot of evidence that those military contractors we pay for are going to remain. So that's part of that whole military industrial apparatus that we really have to challenge. And so why is it's part of the capitalist system. Imperialism is a way of making more money. Amy L. Stacks. This recurrent talk resignature disparities for the US versus others is essential. But so many lefties are hung up on spectacle, and they whine that such talk is unsexy and not worth their attention. How can we make these structural issues attractive to them? Please. Well, that's an important question. How do you get people to deal with the structure of the system rather than the immediate issue where the shoe is pinching? And I think you start with that immediate issue. And as people get mobilized, they begin to realize when they fight for a particular reform that the system is stacked against them. Take affordable housing, which is a huge issue all across the country. And you start fighting for reforms, rent control, building more affordable housing, tenants' rights, and you find out that it's the real estate industry that you're fighting, the whole industry. And structurally, they're opposed to you because you're opposing the ways they can make more money. And then you find out they are the principal financial backing for local power structures, usually Democratic in the cities, but not always, and Republican in Republican areas. That's who the real estate industry backs. So you begin to see, well, what makes the real estate industry tick? And you understand that they've profited from segregation. They profit more when there's scarce affordable housing and it drives rents up. And all those things come. So I think the way to make the structural issues or analysis attractive is to work with people on particular issues and then talk with them about, why we're having trouble, who's opposing us, why are they opposing us, and begin to draw out how the system works. We used to call it power structure analysis back in the 60s. A lot of times, I think some of our movements, they just assume it's the city councilors they got to get. And they don't understand the power structure behind them, how their campaigns are financed, how they operate outside of elections, how whether they invest or not affects the city's economy, and so forth. So I think you fight for reforms, and from there, you build a analysis of why we need revolutionary change or system change. Mackenzie Lacey, how can we speak about Israel's war crimes to people who automatically assume anyone who speaks out against Israel is anti-Semitic? Any tips? Well, you got to draw a distinction between criticizing the state of Israel, which is not everybody there is a Jew, and attacking Jews as such. And that is just a logical, plain distinction that you've got to draw out, because people will throw that at you. If you criticize Israel, you're being anti-Semitic, which is a way of avoiding the criticism of Israel. They're trying to change the subject. So I think you've got to affirm that you're against any discrimination and oppression of Jews, but we're talking about Israel and its policies, which is not the same as all Jews. I think that's the way you handle that. You just got to draw out the distinction. Of course, some of this happens not in a place where you're having interaction, but you make a statement and then somebody lobs a statement at you, Twitter or in a quote in a newspaper, and you got to respond, where you have a platform. But I think that's the distinction we got to make. Criticizing the state of Israel is not attacking all Jews. Z. Kramer, should the U.S. give colonized lands like Hawaii and Guam the opportunity to become their own country? Well, that's up to the people in those island or island groups. In Hawaii, you have both the descendants of indigenous Hawaiians and lots of other people who live on there. The big issue in Hawaii, I mean, there are indigenous people asking for independence. There's a whole new political party, what's it called? Aloha Aina, that, in the long term wants to work for independence, but they recognize it's a long process. In the meantime, there's lands, I think they call it the trust lands, that were set aside for indigenous Hawaiians, which the government in Hawaii, which has been almost all Democratic for a long time, has been saying, well, this land is too important for real estate development, tourist development. So they give it to the developers and take it from the Hawaiians. And I was reading recently about how they snuck into legislation on another topic, the ability of land speculators to take more Native Hawaiian land. So that's the big issue in Hawaii right now. Making sure the indigenous people have the lands that it's like, treaty rights in the, the continental United States. The treaties say the land belongs to the indigenous nations, but a lot of it's been taken from them. And then Guam, it's up to the people of Guam. Last time I looked, there's a debate about statehood, maintaining their current status, or independence. And as I recall, independence was not, was probably in third place. I think that's probably reflecting, small island would have a tough time going independent. So, but whether they should become a state or be in their trust relationship with the United States is what they debate. But in the bottom line is it's up to the people living in those places what their status should be in relation to the U.S. Eric Gray, any tips for how to get more people to understand what the Palestinians are dealing with is basically the same thing as Black people we deal with in this country? Yeah, I think that's an analogy that helps a lot of people understand it, particularly Black people. It's something that, became a big issue in the 60s when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in particular began talking about Palestinian rights. And that became a big issue in the Black Power movement. And the analogies were drawn. White people have a harder time seeing that. But I think it's something that you got to explain to white people and try to help them understand that, you take away people's rights and self-determination and they're colonized. And at least on paper, this is a country founded against being colonized. So I think it's one of those issues you've got to keep explaining. You got to be patient and keep explaining. But silence is complicity, so we got to keep explaining. Lucre Denouncer, is there any left-wing opposition to Netanyahu we can support? Yeah, I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, but I have looked into the far left. The socialist left in Israel is much attenuated. The Labor Party at one time was a, pretty mainstream social democratic party. But when it came to the Palestinian question, they have moved hard to the right as well. One of their leaders, who was it? He got assassinated about 20 or 30 years ago. He was trying to make a deal on a two-party state, and the right wing assassinated him. So I can't speak of specific groups. There are, groups that solidarize with the Palestinians. Most of them are civil society groups. The political opposition is weak. And while I don't know the particular parties, I was reading in Israeli press like Haaretz that the left couldn't get out of its own way. And I'm not even sure they got over the threshold to get representation in the Knesset where they got elected. They're trying to pull together a government for it. So as far as I know, There's no left-wing political party that's got much support in Israel that, we can support. But again, I'm not an expert on, Israeli party politics. Strongflower. Hi, Mr. Howie. I've heard rumors that Americans may lose gun rights under Biden. If this is true, I personally don't agree with this, but would like to know your thoughts. Thank you. Yeah, that's a canard from the right wing. There's no effort by the Biden administration to take any gun rights away. They would like to see things like universal background checks, some limitations on things like bump stocks that turn certain weapons into automatic weapons. But it's not saying they're going to take your pistols, your rifles, your shotguns. That's just not coming. Democratic Party is not proposing that as a whole. There may be, some people on the margins that do. So that is something I don't think you have to worry about. The thing we do have to worry about is how we're going to deal with the fact that we have this mass carnage going on from firearms, people shooting each other and shooting themselves. Tens of thousands every year. We're off the charts compared to other countries. And how are we going to solve that? The root causes, the motivations for people are not in the guns themselves. It's in the social conditions. So that's part of the solution. But also, and this is where there are debates on gun rights and gun safety. Should there be a waiting period when you first get a weapon? Just so people that are hot-headed and want to do something to somebody else or themselves has time to cool down. So that's, for example, one of the gun regulations that's being debated. It might be a good idea. Travis Crystal, have you been reading any good books lately? Yeah, I've been reading a lot of books. One is, I think it's called The Global Police State by William I. Robinson, which is basically, he says there's a transnational capitalist class now with a transnational police state to protect their interests. And so instead of just national states with their own police and military protecting the corporations based in their states, there's now a transnational power structure that controls a lot of these national states, but coordinates the control. So that's a book that I recommend. Another book is called The People's Republic of Walmart, which basically makes the point that it's not a question of whether we're going to have planning. It's a question of who is going to do it and is it going to be democratic? Because Walmart internally is a planned economy bigger than most nation states. So is Amazon. And they provide a good example of what Sears Roebuck did, where some Ayn Rand libertarian became the CEO and he tried to set up a market within the firm where the different divisions were competing with each other, and he destroyed the company. So that's a good book. It's not quite my taste, but it's written in a conversational style with anecdotes that, so it's not just sort of academic, abstract description of what Walmart's doing and why it's planning and so forth. But anyway, those are the two books I've been reading the last few days. And anyway, those are the books I've been reading this week. Anthony Carpinetti, do you think that worker cooperatives are a viable way to build an alternative mode of production? I'm kind of with Marx in the third volume of Capital, where he said cooperatives are basically schools of socialism, but that inside a market where there's still competition driving the people in the cooperatives to compete with workers exploited in regular capitalist firms, driving down wages and working conditions in order to compete. So I don't think we can outcompete capitalism through worker cooperatives. On the other hand, they are schools of socialism and cooperation, and they're a good way to work. When I worked in construction, the best work situation I had was in a worker co-op we set up, because unlike when I worked for another contractor, I got exploited, didn't make much money. Or when I was the contractor, I made more money, but I was working 18 hours a day between being on the job sites during the day and then doing the paperwork and looking for the next job, putting out bids. It was killing me. And so I made more money, but I didn't have a life. In the worker co-op, we shared both the hand work, the sweat work, and the brain work. And we got our fair share of the income of the co-op based on the labor we contributed. So I recommend them as a good way to work if you can get one set up in whatever you do. But I don't think they're by themselves the way we're going to replace capitalism. They are one of many activities we need to do. And I think we got to keep forefront. Basically, we got to get into government and start socializing key industries, and we've done this historically, public power utilities. We need at least socialized health insurance, if not healthcare delivery, like Angela and I campaigned on for a community-controlled national health service. I believe, and we put this in our eco-socialist Green New Deal, we got to start doing public enterprise and planning in the industrial sector in order to create the machinery of clean production, not just in the power sector, but in all sectors. So I think that's how we're going to get there, not just by starting cooperatives and competing with the capitalist firms we already got. Scout Trooper 164 asks, do you believe that 9/11 was also used as an excuse for U.S. elites to wage never-ending war in Afghanistan? Well, we said this at the time. The Green Party of the United States, I think I was quoted in the release, said don't use, or maybe it was the New York Green Party, we said don't use 9/11 as an excuse to start a bunch of wars. We said the people that did it are criminals, they should be brought to justice. But, to go do regime change in Afghanistan and later Iraq and so forth, made things worse for the people in that part of the world, as well as spending trillions of dollars of this country's public revenues that could be used on meeting our own needs or the environmental and social needs of people all over the world, instead of all this destruction. The never-ending war in Afghanistan started in 1978 when Zbigniew Brzezinski, national security aide to Carter, convinced him that we should start supplying and funding the Islamic fundamentalist opposition to the Afghanistan government at that time. And that drew in the Russians, which was Brzezinski's plan. He wanted them to have their own Vietnam, which Afghanistan became in a lot of ways, until they withdrew. And then it's been constant war since then. So that goes back, not just, they say 20 years this coming, whenever I think it's October 1st was the anniversary of the Afghanistan invasion. It'll be 20 years this year. It goes back another 23, 24 years. And it's, been terrible for that country. So yes, 9/11 was used as an excuse to go to war. I'm just saying we were already at war in Afghanistan. Zeke Kramer, do you think Annalena Baerbock, the Green Party candidate for German Chancellor, has a good chance of winning? She does, according to the polls. And, the question for the Green Party, which there's been some debate about, is that good for us? Because she's said to be on foreign policy a hawk. I have seen statements where she stands up for human rights in Russia and China. That's an old tradition in the Green Party, going back to Petra Kelly. She was very active in defending the rights of the Tibetans in China and the rights of Greens and peace activists in the Soviet bloc. But Petra Kelly also said we need universal nuclear disarmament on both sides. And she was so adamant about that when Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to massive reductions in nuclear weapons. She was not satisfied. She was very critical of that. And I would say, she was right. They had to go further. Now, some people are saying the German Green Party is the most militarist, dangerous party in Europe right now. But I haven't seen the quotes to back that up. I don't know, for example, if Baerbock supports the kind of saber-rattling war games that the U.S. has been doing right up against the Russian border. I just don't know. So I'm kind of reserving judgment on that. The good thing about the Greens in Germany and across Europe is they're the only party tendency in Europe that has not had at least one wing of their party succumb to the anti-immigrant bashing, which goes from people like Marine Le Pen on the right to one faction of Die Linke in the German left. And so that's, the Greens have been very good on human rights and social rights for oppressed groups, women, immigrants, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities. And the other question about the Greens is they, in Germany in particular, were complicit with the Social Democratic government in neoliberal austerity measures, which actually make the U.S. look, like flaming socialists, because the cuts they made in Germany, we haven't even got to the point where they could be cut. So it's relative. So I think she has a good chance of winning. I'm just speculating on what it might mean. I think it's clear the American Green Party is to the left of the German Green Party on a lot of these questions. Phil Lembo, what do you think of Michael Hudson's idea that global capitalism is moving toward a kind of neo-feudalism? I think he's right. I think when I was talking earlier about due to chronic overproduction, the lack of profitable investment opportunities in the real economy of production, capitalists have moved to financialization and converting public assets into private assets, putting debt on them, and then, getting things like students and who's the other group that can't go into bankruptcy court and get relief? Getting laws like that passed, which Biden had a big deal in getting passed, maybe 15, 20 years ago. That's the neo-feudalism. I mean, feudalism was based on landlords extracting surplus from their tenants, their peasants, their serfs. And now we've all become debt serfs to the financial sector. And so we have stagnant production, slow growth in that area, while the capitalists are getting richer and richer and the rest of us getting poorer because of this debt burden. I think that's what Michael Hudson is talking about. And I think he's analyzed it, at least from my reading, as well as anybody. There's another book out by a guy in England called Renter Capitalism, which, going back to a previous question, is another book I've been reading. I kind of set that aside. It's pretty dry, but it's very good, in terms of the data it provides and the analysis. So, yeah, I think Hudson is somebody people should be reading for that analysis. Bob Otto, make sure you get outside and enjoy the mild weather. Good vibes. Thank you. Yep, it's in the 70s here. We had snow maybe 10 days ago, if not less than that. So yeah, I am enjoying it. So thank you. Anthony Carpinetti, what would it take to overcome the existential threat of climate change? At this point, I think it takes system change, eco-socialism. The Biden plan is And even the Thrive agenda that the progressive Democrats are pushing, they want $10 trillion over 10 years on this plan. Biden is 2.3 trillion over 10 years or 8 years. But you break that down, that's his American Jobs Plan, his infrastructure plan. Only about 100 billion a year is going into, directly into climate investments that could reduce carbon. And it's pathetic. It's not a real plan. It's basically saying, here's some incentives and subsidies to the oil companies and the energy companies to switch to renewables. Meanwhile, he's promoting nukes, waste incinerators, industrial biofuels, as well as, fracking the hell out of the country and trying to make up for it by carbon capture and storage, which is not economical unless the federal government subsidizes it massively, because carbon dioxide ain't worth much. And you got a bunch of it, you can pump it into the ground. Nobody's going to pay you to do that unless it's the government. So it's just a fantasy land. On the other hand, in order to move as fast as we got to move, which is really one of the things that came out in response to Biden's climate plan from Friends of the Earth, they said for the U.S. to make its fair contribution, it was called the Fair Shares Nationally Determined Contribution, NDC. That's what all the countries are supposed to do under the Paris Climate Accords. They said by 2030, the U.S. needs to cut 70% of its emissions and then contribute 105% more by helping the global South and other countries reduce their emissions. So they're talking about the climate debt and equity. And and Biden didn't talk about this at all in his climate plan, but they want the U.S. to make big contributions to other countries so they can leap over the fossil fuel age into the solar age. And that's just off the table. So what we need is to do this through the public sector with planning, like we did during World War II, when we converted industry on a dime into the arsenal of democracy to arm the allies against the fascists. And that's what we did in that emergency. We need to do at least as much in this emergency through the public sector. And that's going to require coordinated planning. We're going to build mass transit and affordable, clean housing and walkable communities. Well, you got to coordinate the housing construction with the mass transit lines in order to create walkable communities. We need a smart grid that accommodates the distributed nature of wind and solar. And right now, as long as the private utilities, the investor-owned utilities, the IOUs, have control of the grid, they're going to wear out the servo-mechanical grid, which is oriented towards centralized power plants like nuclear and coal, and now gas, rather than the distributed nature of solar and wind. So that's why, we need system change to an eco-socialist approach. That's what it's going to take. If we keep, tinkering like the Biden plan does, we're just not going to get to where we got to be anytime soon enough to stem, catastrophic climate change. Scout Trooper 164. If Joe Biden ends up stepping down, which he might, do you think she will be even worse or be just the same? And yes, Kamala Harris. I think she will be a product, much like Biden is, of the larger power structure. Who are the donors? Who are the big capitalists, bankers and so forth that decide on investments? And that's who, if you're going to stick within a capitalist economy, you got to please. Otherwise, they'll pull the rug out from under your economy and blame you for the problems, because they make the investment decisions. She has no history of being certainly a socialist, not even a progressive populist when it comes to economic questions. One thing that particularly disturbs me is, her staff, when she was Attorney General of California, came with over 1,000 indictment recommendations against One West and Steve Mnuchin for predatory lending and foreclosures. And she declined to prosecute. And then Mnuchin gave her, I think it was $2,000 for her Senate campaign. along with his fellow real estate exploiter, Donald Trump. And Ivanka Trump gave the biggest donations to Kamala Harris when she ran for the Senate in California. So I think that's who she ultimately answers to. That's who paid for her political career. I'm sure there'll be personal differences, inclinations. Personnel does mean policy to a certain extent, but that larger structure, she rose within it and never showed any signs of wanting to really change it. So I don't think it'll make that much difference on the big questions. Travis Crystal, Howie, are you familiar with the free software movement? Free as in freedom, not gratis. Freedom to run software as you wish, to read, modify the source code, and redistribute the software. Yeah, I'm not a big techie, but that's like open source. And I do recall reading about a dispute between Bill Gates and one of the early innovators in software. And Gates' thing was, you got to make this private rather than open source so we can make a lot of money. And I see, software as like everything in our, wealth of knowledge and science. It's the common heritage or inheritance of humanity. And to privatize it is just a way for some people to make money off it. Plus, there's a lot of evidence when you have open source and more people have access to look at it, tinker with it, you get better innovation than when it's private. And, Microsoft, they get to the point where they're a monopoly. They don't have so much incentive to tinker with it because they got you where they want you. You got to have them to get online and use their tools. So if free software is the same as open source, yeah, I'm for it. Yeah, today, partisan for-profit companies counter votes using secret proprietary source code. Is it viable publicly to hand count votes in the US with so many races and propositions on our ballots? You should always have the option of hand counting in a recount. You can use scanners that count votes by reading the ballot, the paper ballot. The source code should be open to examination, not proprietary. And you can always fall back on a hand count if the scanners, when you audit them, seem to be making mistakes, or it's a very close election where you want to just hand count them so everybody can see the result. I think we're moving that way. There are a lot of states removing the ability of some of these companies to run the software of our elections with proprietary source code, although we're far from completing that. And I believe HR 1 speaks to that in some of its provisions. Here's a question submitted offline. Is the drug war contributing to the situation in Colombia? Yeah, I mean, everybody in Colombia, all sides making money off cocaine. That is something everybody's known. And when I say all sides, to read, it's another book I read recently, and I want to make sure I got the right author. He's written about the CIA drug wars, going back to Vietnam and Afghanistan. And anyway, what he provides evidence for is that the CIA has been making money off this trade too. So, we had Plan Colombia supposedly to fight the coca plantations and the drug trafficking. And it turned out a lot of it was used against the coca plantations that was going to the FARC or people that weren't controlled by the regime. But the regime leaders were making money off the trade. but we, in Plain Colombia, weren't going after those coca fields. And then, in Bolivia, the guy who represented the movement for socialism, and I'm blanking on his name, the indigenous person, he was head of the coca farmers union before he became president. And he served a couple terms. He wanted to serve a third term, apparently won the election, but they had a lawfare coup and he got out of the country. Now his old party's been reelected in Bolivia. Sorry, I'm blanking on his name. But the point is that, the coca leaves are used for more than just, cocaine. And in a more diluted form, I mean, the people that work in those Andean countries, high altitude, chew the leaves as a stimulus, like I guess coffee. So the drug war, it comes back to also, why is there a market here when these drugs are illicit rather than legal, regulated, and taxed, with drug treatment freely available through a public healthcare system? So Plan Colombia was part of the war on drugs, and it justified militarizing that country, where the military is repressing now the political rights of people protesting, the austerity measures, and now the brutality by the police. So yeah, it's part of the, I'm trying to remember that author's name. I'm going to find it for you. I got one name in mind. There's a couple authors. Can't remember the title of the book. When I went into the Marine Corps, they said we could bring one book. And a couple of us brought a book about an expose of the CIA role in the heroin trade in Southeast Asia. And again, I'm forgetting the title of the book. But it's that author. And Alfred McCoy, that's the author. Scout Trooper 164, what do you believe is the worst atrocity the U.S. had committed? Oh man, I hate to rank them. There's so many atrocities, particularly in the wars against indigenous nations, the atrocities of, it wasn't the U.S., it was the white supremacists, the Redeemers, after or during Reconstruction, who violently overthrew the Reconstruction governments. Vietnam was terrible. Korea was terrible. All the civilians killed with, everything from carpet bombing to Agent Orange, depleted uranium weapons in Iraq. I don't want to rank them. There are too many atrocities. Violet at Content Boutique. I saw a headline this morning about El Salvador choosing dictatorship over democracy. What do you make of this? I'm not familiar with what is going on in El Salvador at the moment. I know there's been, back and forth between more left-wing, more democratic political movement, the FLMN, and the old right-wing oligarchy more interested in dictatorship. I don't know, did they have an election and the right wing won? I'm not sure. So I really can't say more than that. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions. And I hadn't gathered any final thoughts. But I will say, this Biden seems to be on a honeymoon. I was astounded to see Pramila Jayapal, who's the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, give Biden an A for what he's done so far. when we were running, a bunch of prominent progressive personalities were writing open letters. And these are the same people that was saying, like in 2004, when Bush was in there and Kerry was running against him, even though Kerry was also pro-war, vote safe states. Vote for the Greens in the states we already know the outcome of, but vote for Kerry in the battleground states. This time, instead of a safe state strategy, it was a no state strategy. Vote for Biden everywhere. And part of the rationale was that would stop a coup, which I don't think made any sense. But one of the titles of one of their letters was, "Don't Trump, then Battle Biden." Well, I'm wondering when the Battle Biden part starts, because I don't see much on the left being critical of Biden. Seems like a lot of the left liberals are just, giddy that Biden's actually proposed, for example, paid leave. Now, that paid leave proposal is really, really stingy. It'll take 10 years to get to 12 weeks paid leave. And, countries like the Nordic countries, it's over a year now, how long paid leave you get when you have a child. So, they're not battling Biden. They're kind of cheerleading. And meanwhile, that's domestic policy. And he acknowledges there's a climate problem, even though his plan doesn't even measure up to what's needed. On foreign policy, as I said at the top, imperialism hasn't skipped a beat from Trump to Biden. And we're seeing that right now in Colombia and in Israel, Palestine. And we don't have much of an anti-war peace movement. And that's what we got to build. That's why I said at the beginning, we need the Green Party more than ever, because we need an alternative to this stuff. And I think I also mentioned that ranked choice voting, particularly for proportional representation from multi-seat districts and legislative bodies, is probably the thing we can win in the near future that's going to open up political space for us and get us into legislatures where we'll have a permanent, legitimate platform to present our point of view and to put the power structure on the spot for some of these policies where they're not being challenged now. There's a lot of talk about Sanders and the squad, but they're not really fighting Biden and the corporate Democrats. They're tweeting, they're issuing press releases, they're putting in legislation, but they're not being real critical where the criticism needs to be made. And more than that, trying to mobilize a movement against some of these policies we're getting from the corporate Democrats and Biden. That's why we need the Greens independent inside the Democratic Party. They're compromised because if they push too hard, they lose access to committees, campaign funding, getting their legislation considered. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, always wanted to be on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And she asked to be on it when a seat opened up after the last election. And the corporate leadership found Kathleen Rice, a conservative Democrat from Long Island, to run against AOC. So the Policy and Steering Committee of the House Democratic Caucus, which is their, makes those decisions on committee assignments, voted 46-13 for Rice over AOC. I think that kind of quantifies the balance of forces between the corporate Democrats and the progressive Democrats. And, what we should tell the progressive Democrats, they need us on the outside if they ever want any leverage on the inside. Because without a strong independent left, the progressives in the Democratic Party can be ignored. Because where are they going to go? They're not going to vote for the Republicans. Corporate Democrats know they got them in their pocket, so they ignore them. So it goes back to, we got to buckle down, organize our locals, start electing more people to local office, win ranked choice voting and proportional representation, and keep on fighting. So have a good week fighting and being active.